B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Friday, August 14th, 2020. We've got a heat wave weekend underway here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Will Donald Trump issue a pardon to Edward Snowden? Well, he is dangling the possibility. And, of course, Trump fakes a lot of the time about things that he might do and never follows through with. And so this could be just another, little trial balloon that Trump has floated. But today, Congressman Tom Massie of Kentucky, he's a Republican, but he's been ostracized from the party. You'll remember that he's the guy who demanded a full vote on one of the coronavirus bills coming through the House and pissed off Democrats and Republicans alike. But I do respect the independent streak that Massie shows. He is a fighter for the Fourth Amendment, and he and that guy from Michigan, Justin Amash, they are outliers of the Republican Party because they are generally opposed to regime change wars. So it doesn't surprise me that Massie would step out of line and call for a pardon of Ed Snowden. And Trump's made some comments recently in an interview with the New York Post a couple of days ago. There are a lot of people that think he's not being treated fairly. I mean, I hear that. Many people are on his side. I will say that. I don't know him, never met him. So, but many people are on his side. Now, that is hardly any, deep commitment on his part. But because he's pissed so many people off with the commutation of Roger Stone's sentence, the pardoning of Joe Arpaio, the criminal former sheriff of Maricopa County, Phoenix, Arizona, maybe this is his idea of a way to kind of, balance his use of the pardon power. It has been arbitrary and often very impulsive. There's a process you're supposed to go through to get a pardon. And Trump doesn't bother with that. He just kind of, says, pardon me, pardon you. And there is a Pardon Snowden petition with more than 1 million signatures that was delivered to the White House in Trump's first year in office. But we have to balance that with the behavior of his Justice Department in the attempt to extradite Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, from London to face charges and lifetime imprisonment here in the United States. And today there was a bizarre hearing in London around a number of issues leading up to the scheduled September 7th start of the proceedings, the formal proceedings that, appear to be predetermined. The judge in the case is deeply biased, Vanessa Baratzer, and she often reads from scripted remarks. So proceedings were held up this morning, initially, so that Julian Assange could converse for the first time in 5 months with his legal team. So he's been in deep isolation at the Belmarsh prison. Now, the prosecutors didn't even show up. Apparently, they were told that the hearing was going to start in mid-afternoon, but it was actually scheduled for the morning. I don't understand that. And only 5 members of the press were allowed to enter the courtroom to monitor proceedings. Other journalists, observers attempting to listen via telephone could not, as they were given the number to another courtroom. And one journalist who did make it inside the hearing said that the judge was clearly reading from a pre-written ruling. But one of the shuffles, and this is what I blame Trump and Barr and the American side for, is that under the process, the defense, the lawyers representing Assange, were required to submit their response to the charges by the end of July. They did so, and 2 days later, the U.S. issued a superseding indictment. And the charges weren't generally changed. They were just kind of expanded on. Different citations were used to support them. But it is a different set of charges than the one that the defense responded to, the one that is before the court. And so this raises some anomalous issues. For example, has Assange actually been charged under the new superseding indictment? It appears not. I'm quoting now from the report at Mint Press under the byline of Alan MacLeod. Judge Baratzer stated that Assange has not even been arrested under the new indictment and is still being held under the old one that is now null and void. And so MacLeod does us a favor here. He says, thus, to recap, the defendant, who is not even legally under arrest, had not even seen the new charges for which were the same as the old ones, or met with his defense team for 5 months. The judge was reportedly reading from a pre-written script. The prosecution didn't turn up. Journalists could not watch or listen to the proceedings, which were interrupted by screaming from the prison where Assange is being kept and where he joined by a video link. And Joe Laria adds to the coverage over at consortiumnews.com, and he offers a couple of other additional details here. He says the defense argued that there wasn't enough time before the scheduled resumption of the hearing on September 7th to deal with a new indictment, said it was too late to introduce new evidence to the court. The U.S. had a June deadline to submit all evidence to the British extradition court. So the U.S. is playing fast and loose here, and the defense has argued that the new or the latest superseding indictment should be flushed. And, of course, you would expect a reasonable, unbiased judge to give that deep consideration and maybe even follow through on it. So ultimately, the defense asked for the procedural hearing to be postponed until next Friday to give it time to decide whether to ask for an extension of the September date. Baratzer asked for it to be pushed back to Wednesday, not Friday, and with this scheduling issue apparently unresolved, Baratzer adjourned the hearing until September 7th, pending any applications for delay. So that saga plays on, and we will continue to cover it here. Meanwhile, YouTube made an announcement yesterday that the fruits of hacking will not be permitted to be discussed or covered on videos posted on the YouTube site. Their goal is to remove content that contains hacked information, the disclosure of which may interfere with democratic processes such as elections and censuses. An example they offered, they will be deleting videos that contain hacked information about a political candidate. Now, of course, it's in dispute. We know that WikiLeaks published information from the 2016 campaign that embarrassed Hillary Clinton and John Podesta. But the allegation that that came from a Russian hack of the DNC has been proven to be unproven. In case you haven't heard, because the New York Times refuses to update its reporting, in May, a document was released, a transcript of a hearing before the House Intelligence Committee, where the head of CrowdStrike, one Sean Henry, was forced to admit that we don't actually have evidence that anything was removed from DNC servers. We think people were in there rummaging around. We think that they organized things to exfiltrate, but we have no evidence that that ever happened. So just given that example, would the WikiLeaks published materials in 2016 now be banned from discussion on YouTube because the government claims it came from hacking? And what about leaked material? Well, this is a really slippery slope. And in addition to banning what would likely be independent media reports or even just individuals talking into their cell phone camera. YouTube promised to raise up authoritative voices when it comes to current events and politics by changing its algorithm to show users more credible channels and reduce the spread of harmful misinformation and what they call borderline content. And what do they consider to be authoritative content? Well, Fox News and CNN. Now, the other night, after Kamala Harris was named as the running mate for Joe Biden, somebody sent me a link to a YouTube video. It's a guy I've never heard of. Can't remember his name right now. But he sat in a chair with a big pillow behind his back and kind of yelled at his phone some stuff about Kamala Harris that was true. But he went into a lengthy rant about the fact, or his claim, I don't actually know this for a fact, that Kamala Harris is estranged from her father, who is alleged to be a Marxist professor of economics. Now, I'll admit I've never heard much about Dad. In all of the, gauzy biographical material you hear about Kamala Harris, we don't hear about Dad. We hear about her mom. We hear about her sister, Maya. So I'm curious about this. But I would consider the video to be borderline because he went on and on with a kind of armchair psychoanalysis of how the estrangement between Harris and her dad is evidenced in her political behavior. Now, I find it interesting. I believe he is entitled to express this. I don't believe in censorship. But my reaction to it was, well, this is kind of borderline. And so who gets to decide? What is borderline? Whose borders? I mean, it's almost comical. But when you get to the issue of hack versus leak and the right of Americans to share information with each other under the First Amendment, well, that is lost. And let me concede that legally, the First Amendment is a notion when it comes to platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, because their claim that they are not publishers, they simply post user content, in general, absolves them from any responsibility to decide what content should be there and what content shouldn't. And on the other hand, in addressing the consumers of their services, they have a right to weed out obscene materials, pornography, whatever they decide. But this shift to much tighter standards with questionable parameters leaves me chilled. And yeah, my podcast is on YouTube. I do it as just an easy way for people to grab my podcast because YouTube is on most people's phones. And the truth is, I don't get a lot of traffic there. I don't know why. But this leaves me prepared to drop YouTube as an outlet for the PBC podcast. Yesterday, we led our podcast with the news of a deal that Trump claims to be the broker of between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The deal is that the two Middle East countries will set up a normalization of relations with embassies, with a lifting of any travel restrictions, and that the Israeli side of the deal is that they will suspend the planned annexation of communities that are illegally occupying parts of the West Bank. And when we look at the second-day coverage, even the New York Times admits that Netanyahu's pledge to suspend can be withdrawn at any time. that the relations between the UAE and Israel have been fairly warm but under the table for several years now. So that's old news. And quoting from the Times, Israel and the Emirates have long maintained a thinly veiled secret relationship over mutual interests. The idea of formalizing it has come up several times over the past year. But the two sides essentially took it into the open after 6 weeks of indirect talks through our Crown Prince Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, culminating in Thursday's phone call between Trump, Netanyahu, and MBZ. That is Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and de facto ruler of the UAE. So what does this tell us? Well, my own impressions are that this is a gift from Netanyahu to Trump, and that once again Israel is trying to influence the United States election coming up, paying back Trump's support for Netanyahu in the multiple elections that Israel has held in the past 2 years. And my other impression is that this is a face-saving way for Netanyahu to, at least for now, back off on his threat of formal annexation of the occupied communities in the West Bank. But of course, it has riled the Palestinians. They believe that the Arabs in the UAE have betrayed them, and I can understand that. And the whole Trump drive for what he calls a peace process, driven by Kushner, is to isolate the Palestinians. We've cut funding to them. We've ignored them. They've decided to ignore us back. And so they're essentially trying to cram down de facto deals on the Palestinians by working with other parties in the region and aligning them with Israel. And, of course, they'd like the Saudis to be next, but that, despite the collaboration that does occur between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that may be a step too far at this time. So there's commentary that's widely published. I saw it at Mint Press, I saw it at Consortium News, and also at Mondo Weiss. Medea Benjamin of Code Pink and her colleague Ariel Gold take on this alleged peace deal. And they write, though it will supposedly stave off Israeli annexation of the West Bank and encourage tourism and trade between both countries, in reality, it is nothing more than a scheme to give an Arab stamp of approval to Israel's status quo of land theft, home demolitions, arbitrary extrajudicial killings, apartheid laws, and other abuses of Palestinian rights. They continue, the deal should be seen in the context of over 3 years of Trump administration policies that have tightened Israel's grip on the Palestinians, moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, and creating a so-called peace plan with no Palestinian participation or input. While no U.S. administration has successfully brokered a resolution to Israel's now 53-year-long occupation, the Trump years have been especially detrimental to the Palestinian cause. They say with Donald Trump at the helm and Kushner as the primary strategist, even concessions for Palestinians have been done away with. To add insult to injury, while the deal has been couched in terms of a commitment by Israel to suspend annexation, Netanyahu said annexation is still on the table and it's something that he is committed to. And over at Consortium News, they republish a Common Dreams article under the byline of Julia Connolly. She quotes Medea Benjamin and Ariel Gold quite a bit. But she adds this quote from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Detroit, a Palestinian American. We won't celebrate Netanyahu for not stealing land he already controls in exchange for a sweetheart business deal. And I think that is a fair, critical assessment. And at The Intercept, journalist Murtaza Hussein tweeted, the Trump administration hit upon the Nobel Peace Prize winning idea that you can supposedly solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by pretending Palestinians don't exist. And Omar Badar of the Arab American Institute is quoted, "There's nothing historic or groundbreaking about this agreement. Israel and the UAE have been strong allies under the table for many years. This is merely making that friendship public." A former FBI lawyer who admitted some time back that he was involved in the sanitizing of information related to the effort to get a warrant from the FISA court to wiretap and otherwise surveil Carter Page, who was a schlub advisor to the Trump campaign in 2016. The former FBI lawyer is named Kevin Kleinsmith. And basically, he was asked by an FBI colleague who was preparing the warrant application on Page if Page had been a previous informant to the CIA, which he had been. Apparently, Kleinsmith got confirmation of that from a contact at the CIA and then wrote an email to his FBI colleague claiming that there had been no contact, that, quote, Page was not a source for the CIA. So this is the first conviction, it's a plea deal, from the Bill Barr, John Durham investigation of the origins of Russiagate, and they are looking into corrupt behavior by the CIA, the FBI, and members of the Obama administration. And it was only yesterday that Trump was verbally whipping Bill Barr and publicly saying this is his chance to show that he's a great man. And once again, Trump is inappropriately interfering in the operation of the Justice Department, egging them on to deliver the political investigation and hoped for by Trump indictments of Obama-era officials. And as I keep saying, I have mixed feelings about this because I think that they will find damaging information that could lead to future indictments and possible prosecutions. At the same time, this is clearly calculated for political purposes, timed to the election cycle, and so we must approach it with equal skepticism. And that's how I plan to proceed. So Michael Cohen, the former fixer and lawyer in the Trump organization, who's now at home with an ankle bracelet serving out the rest of his prison term, well, that book that the feds tried to stop by sending him back to prison, and then a judge said, no, he can continue to serve his sentence at home. And it was suggested that the re-imprisonment was a retaliation for Cohen's refusal to agree not to write and publish a book. So apparently the book is almost finished. A title has been selected, Disloyal, the true story of the former personal attorney to President Donald J. Trump. And last night, it's a little early for bedtime reading, but Rachel Maddow read what I think is the entire foreword to the book. And it does offer some amazing observations. And Cohen is self-deprecating. He says he knows that you may not like him, but like somebody who used to work for a mob boss, maybe you'll put that aside and listen to what I have to say, which includes that Donald Trump has no true friends, that he has always operated with a group of people who are loyal to him, and that he has acquaintances and contacts and business associates, but he is quite a loner. Here's a quote. I bore witness to the real man in strip clubs, shady business meetings, and in the unguarded moments when he revealed who he really was. A cheat, a liar, a fraud, a bully, a racist, a predator, a con man. So this is a teaser. It is designed to get people salivating about a book that may come out in September or October. Doesn't have a publication date, and Cohen has not told us if he has been signed by a publisher and who that might be. Now, here's a juicy tidbit. Trump colluded with the Russians, but not in the sophisticated ways imagined by his detractors. Trump had cheated in the election with Russian connivance, as you will discover, but that's not in the foreword, of course. And what he suggests is that because he talks about Trump's effort to operate in Russia going back to when it was the Soviet Union. And he puts himself in the center of some of that. As we already know, that he and Felix Sater, who was a Russian national, came to the United States, worked for Trump, went to prison, became an FBI informant. Trump now says he never knew him. Well, Sater and Cohen were trying to set up a deal for a Trump Tower in Moscow. And Michael Cohen was so influential that he sent an email to the equivalent of info@putin.com. Or I guess it would be putin.ru. And so we do have to put into perspective here that Michael Cohen is a bit of a joke. And he was inflated when he was Trump's go-to fixer and kind of a bully proxy. And he does appear to be telling the truth, and I have to say that what I have read from his foreword is fairly well written, which I would not have expected from Michael Cohen. So I've never heard of S.V. Dept. This is a male who is the White House correspondent for HuffPost. Thursday at the White House briefing, he appeared to be shocked when he got a rare opportunity to be called upon by Trump. He says Trump usually calls on a handful of people who are fairly reliable, either for him to beat up or they'll ask a softball question. And Dept said he waited 5 years to get called on. So he asked Trump, Mr. President, after 3.5 years, do you regret it all the lying you've done to the American people? And Trump appeared to be taken aback. He said, all the what? And Dept said, all the lying, all the dishonesties. Trump, that who has done? Dept, you have done tens of thousands, and that's where he got cut off. And Trump just moved on and called on another reporter in the room. S.V. Dept, nice going. So the president, who has spent months, we lost count after 70 comments and tweets about the threat of mail-in voting and massive fraud and all that stuff. Well, there's a Florida primary coming up next Tuesday, and Don and Melania have filed for their mail-in ballots. But he already said, Florida, it's okay in Florida. You don't have to worry about that. And before we dive into the latest about the attack on the post office, a Pew Research Center poll says that only 17% of Trump voters, or those who lean toward voting for Trump, cite voting by mail as their preference. But the people who support Biden, 58%, said they prefer voting by mail. Now, as I've said before, I continue to find this bizarre that Trump thinks that the people who support him won't vote by mail, and so by throwing a big spanner in the machinery at the post office, that he can stop more Democratic votes than Republican votes. And these poll numbers do suggest at least fuzzy math that might support the president's bizarre thinking. But I just don't understand. He clearly is creating the smokescreen of potential fraud as a way of diverting people's attention from the voter suppression by Republican operatives that occurs in every election, and it is mostly focused on people who vote at the precinct. So a federal judge in Pittsburgh has ordered the Trump campaign to produce proof of these voter fraud claims from mail-in voting. District judge, so that's a federal judge, Nicholas Ranjan, on Thursday ordered Republicans who've challenged Pennsylvania's expansion of mail-in voting to turn over their evidence by the end of today that the system has led to ballot irregularities or face the possible dismissal of their suit. And there is one case in New Jersey where two Democrats are accused of trying to meddle with some mail-in ballots. But the best-known case in recent years is the 2018 ballot harvesting operation in the 10th District of North Carolina that led even the Republican-controlled election authorities there to order the race nullified and the election rerun. That is the most recent outstanding case of manipulation of mail-in ballots. So I don't know that the lawyers who are supporting Trump, I don't know that they work for him, will be willing to make that argument. So, the efforts by Louis DeJoy, who is the Trump appointee as Postmaster General, drew a clever headline from Dave Pell. He's a guy who blogs, and he sends me a daily blast about his blog post. It's called Next Draft. So he took DeJoy's name and wrote a clever headline, DeJoy of Crooking. And so the moves that DeJoy has made at the Postal Service don't meet the fundamental smell test. He's cut overtime. He's allowed deliveries to be delayed and, of course, the internal workings of the post office to slow down. He's removed some number here of sorting machines, 671 of them scattered across the country, that have the capacity to sort 21 million pieces of paper mail per hour. So he's clearly running a wrecking crew. Last Friday, he fired or reassigned some 20 officials at the top of the Postal Service job tree. And so it's clear, and Trump admitted it, confirmed it yesterday, that the effort here is to create the perception that if you vote by mail, the Postal Service is going to screw it up, it won't arrive in time, and your vote won't be counted. So in Florida, where Trump is claiming false residency at Mar-a-Lago and going to vote by mail in Tuesday's primary, for the presidential primary back in March, 18,500 mailed ballots arrived too late to be counted. And tens of thousands of late ballots in Pennsylvania were counted only after courts intervened. So part of this is, again, the checkerboard nature of our election system, where we don't have uniformity from one state to the next, and the standards for when an absentee ballot is due vary. Here in California, it has to be postmarked by Election Day. Now, one problem there is when you use prepaid envelopes, they don't often get postmarked. But they're clearly identified as election mail. And as they're going through the sorting process, they can easily be postmarked. That's simply a decision issue. But there are many states where you have to mail it for the absentee ballot to arrive in time for midnight on Election Day. And in many areas, you cannot guess exactly how long it takes for the mail to go through. And we know that in some cases, if you deposit mail that is intended to be delivered just in the next town over, it doesn't go from your mailbox or the mailbox you deposited in to that next town. It goes to a central processing office where it is then dispatched to its destination. And as part of the continuing voter suppression effort in Ohio, the latest Republican Secretary of State there has decreed, on no basis, that local election offices cannot set up drop boxes for ballots at shopping centers or in, near a grocery store. They're only allowed to have one location per county, and it has to be at the county election office. So the dimensions of this scheme are now pretty clear. And in most cases, I believe that it's a lot of bullshit. Because if the Postal Service wants to, they can direct their workers to prioritize the distribution of ballots to voters and the return of those voters' ballots to the election office. And the rest of this is just an effort to confuse and to insert chaos. You know, all that shit that they say Russia's trying to do. Barack Obama has piped up on this. He did mention it at John Lewis's funeral. But in a podcast with his former campaign manager, David Plouffe, quote, "Everyone depends on the Postal Service, seniors for their Social Security, veterans for their prescriptions, small businesses trying to keep their doors open. They can't be collateral damage for an administration more concerned with suppressing the vote than suppressing a virus." There's been a definitive ruling from the Government Accountability Office that the two top attack dogs that Trump has installed at Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, the acting secretary, and Ken Cuccinelli, the acting deputy, are serving in violation of federal law. The Federal Vacancies Reform Act lays out specific orders of succession when senior officials resign or are sacked. And following the push out of Kirstjen Nielsen as the head of DHS, those rules were not followed when Trump handpicked Cuccinelli and Wolf, and they have served now, I believe, beyond the deadline for temporary appointments. So it's in violation of federal law, and like so many other things, nothing will happen. Oh, and there's one more item here that Trump is trying to sow more doubt. Again, what we blame Russia for. He's gone birther on us. He picked up a crackpot commentary from some guy who is challenging the citizenship of Kamala Harris because her parents may not have been citizens at the time she was born. And, of course, that doesn't matter in any way, shape, or form. So this is a complete concoction. But Trump loves this shit. Speaking to reporters yesterday, he said, "I heard it today that she doesn't meet the requirements. I have no idea if that's right." And, of course, a responsible person wouldn't repeat something that they don't know is right. Oh, but he went on, I would have assumed that the Democrats would have checked that out before she gets chosen to run for vice president. Yeah, right. When I remember, I try to pause every day to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today I remembered to bring a list into the studio here. I want to thank Faith Peoples, Paul Tomaselli, Eric Thomas, and Elizabeth Vasquez. They each chip in $5 a month, sometimes more, to support my work, keep the lights on, pay for the phone bills, and all that sort of stuff. And I really appreciate the support of everyone who does have a subscription. If you don't and you want to, all you got to do is visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. I am tickled by the spontaneous sit-in that occurred yesterday in the 100,000 population community of Bend, Oregon. It's a couple hours north of Portland, and a little bit to the east. And 2 men were picked up by ICE. They were placed in unmarked buses that were parked in a hotel parking lot. And when people got wind of it, a local activist called from a group called Central Oregon Peacekeepers heard about it, went to the scene. Then a member of the city council, Barb Campbell, showed up. She parked her vehicle in front of one of the buses and set up a lawn chair. And as the day wore on, hundreds of protesters gathered. And this led ICE and Homeland Security. And we don't know where they got the goons. But later in the day, a cadre of cops or officers in riot gear with heavy weapons showed up. I believe they did use a little tear gas. And they were able ultimately to get the 2 detainees off the buses, spirit them away. But I applaud the efforts of the crowd to advocate for those men and put their lives in front of an ICE bus. In Portland, I don't have any report on any skirmishes on the streets last night. But yesterday, the contingent of 100 Oregon State Police troopers was pulled out of the city of Portland, and this was a scheduled event. They were assigned to be there for a 2-week rotation, and they have now handed off everything to the Portland police. We are told that there are still federal officers from the Federal Protective Service in Portland, but they haven't shown their helmets and visors and heavy arms in the past 2 weeks. So will this embolden protesters to go back on the offense at the Hatfield Federal Courthouse? Well, I hope they will move on, because fundamentally I don't want to give Trump the pretext to deploy more federal stormtroopers. My old buddy Jason Leopold's at it again. Over at BuzzFeed, he used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain records from Homeland Security and also from the Federal Protective Service, which is a division of DHS. And those documents show that after the killing of George Floyd, an information bulletin issued on May 29th by Protective Services Investigations Branch warned that many of these demonstrations will continue to include destruction and/or violence. Participants may be wielding rudimentary weaponry, improvised incendiary devices, and may conduct their attack if an opportunity exists. And the reporters who co-wrote this with Leopold say that they scoured the documents, and it's almost entirely focused on Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And very little information that would say that they are focused on white supremacist armed activists, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys. And there has been evidence that they were on the scene provoking violence in many cities. A May 29 DHS report found that white supremacists on Telegram, that's an encrypted messaging service, discussed using cocktails, Molotov, I guess, chainsaws and firearms against riot police. But this was the only mention in the intelligence reports referencing white activists, and it notes that protesters in Washington had informed authorities of a small group of approximately 4 to 5 white supremacists in the crowd, and there is no further comment or alarming remarks. So this shows the bias of these agencies. And once again, this is part of the vertical integration of law enforcement in this country that followed 9/11. And we were told that it was only to protect you and me from dangerous foreign terrorists. And the way this has been abused and misused is something that we should see the Democrats attempting to fix. And as we've talked in the past, They had the opportunity, because budget bills originate in the House, to just put aside next year's funding that starts October 1st for Homeland Security and all of its organs. But they didn't. If you haven't had a chance over the weekend, I hope you'll listen to our latest in-depth interview with environmental journalist Steve Horn. We covered a lot of ground, including the bizarre plan for Chevron, with the help of Goldman Sachs, to build a solar-powered fracking site in Kern County. That's Southern California, where Bakersfield is. That's the biggest oil patch in California. And one of the things that Horn and I discussed is that in lieu of the moratorium on fracking that lasted about 6 months, it started last November, that the industry offered to, well, maybe it didn't come from the industry, but there was a proposal to increase the buffer zones, legally referred to as setbacks, so that people wouldn't be living right next to a fracking operation or an oil drilling rig or its related pipes and infrastructure. And Horn told us about the way that a bill entitled AB 345, which defined these new rules for setbacks, had been heavily watered down in a legislative committee in Sacramento at the behest of oil interests and the labor unions that support them. And yesterday, the watered-down bill, which really was reduced to a recommendation, died in a Senate committee. The pivotal vote came from Senator Bob Hertzberg, a Democrat from Van Nuys. And Hertzberg has a lot of support from the labor unions who are in favor of this project. And this is cited in the village of Lost Hills, 97% Latino, and a community that features widespread poverty. 2014, and I'm reading from the LA Times, by the way, a 2014 report determined that more than 5.4 million Californians live within a mile of at least one oil or gas well. And the 2,500-foot setback is shorter than that 1 mile distance. We also know that exposure to the methane that is leaking and just the heavy industrial elements of an oil extraction operation place pregnant women and others at risk. And so when you hear the podcast, you'll hear many ways in which California paints itself green. But you just scratch the surface. And just like on the Beverly Hillbillies, that bubbling crude just pops right up. Here's today's COVID-19 update, and I thank Linda Lewis for continuing to put this together for me every day. Worldwide, the numbers are continuing to climb, of course. Confirmed cases at almost 21 million. The death toll worldwide reported at 760,000. That was up by 7,000 worldwide yesterday. And deaths in the United States increased by more than 1,100. We had a couple of days where the national report was 500 deaths, but that was not sustained. We have 5.26 million cases in the United States and 167,000 deaths to date. The New York Times reports that the 5 metropolitan areas that now have the highest rate of new coronavirus cases are all in South Texas. The 7-day positivity rate in Texas has dropped to 16%. It had been over 20% for the past week. And Governor Greg Abbott, who either is intentionally fudging the data or just doesn't know better, he tried to tell us that this was a result of too much testing. During the month of July, there were several surge testing operations where we dramatically increased the amount of testing in different regions at different periods of time, and that led to a very abundant number of tests that were done. At the same time, we saw a lot of people, a lot of residents in different regions step toward wanting to get tested. We have observed for the past couple of weeks a decline in the number of people stepping forward to get tested, so it's their fault. But Linda makes an important note here. She said, the number of tests is not related to the positivity rate. However, the uneven distribution of testing could cause fluctuation in the positivity rate if, for example, many tests were done in high-income areas and few in poor areas, or vice versa. Somebody should take a look at the geographic distribution over the past month. And, Linda, I fully agree with you. Meanwhile, the outbreak in New Zealand, a cluster that emerged on Tuesday, has grown to 30 cases as of today. Officials struggle to explain a lack of regular testing for border officials and workers who manage hotel quarantine for about 400 residents returning every day from overseas. They apparently believe that they are the spreaders, maybe not super spreaders, but spreaders in this case. Leaked emails from government officials published by a newspaper in Melbourne, The Age, identified a hotel night manager as patient 0. He tested positive for the virus May 26, worked at one of the largest quarantine hotels in the city. And 5 security guards at the same hotel later tested positive. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have updated their guidance to suggest that people who have recovered from COVID-19 can safely mingle with others for 3 months. So this appears to be the current estimate of how long the antibodies remain active and can fight off the virus in a human body. That's mildly encouraging because we weren't sure that there was any extension of the antibodies beyond a couple of weeks. But of course, other viruses often leave people immune because of the level of antibodies that are produced. In Rolling Stone, Matt Taibbi describes how the race to develop treatments and a vaccine will create an historic windfall for the industry, and we will pay the price. The production of pharmaceutical drugs is still a nearly riskless, subsidy-laden scam, says Taibbi. For the industry, the pandemic is an unprecedented profiteering opportunity because most everyone on Earth is destined to become a customer of some kind. In fact, the U.S. is already a massive buyer of COVID-19 treatments, despite no evidence of efficacy. Taibbi describes how the U.S. drug approval and pricing process is different from that of every other country in the world. He notes that Trump has failed to use tools at his disposal, including the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, and that's not B-U-Y. It's named after, I guess, Birch Bayh of Indiana. Also, there's a part of federal law called Section 1498 that can lower drug prices. Trump did sign 4 executive orders recently that ostensibly would lower prices of generics through several means, including allowing importation from Canada and forcing Medicaid to buy drugs at the same prices that other countries pay. And Taibbi says it was amusing to hear the CEO of Pfizer complain that Trump was ushering in socialized medicine. The New York Times today publishes some graphs and a couple of articles showing that excess deaths have peaked during the coronavirus pandemic. And they argue that the true toll, the death toll, is already over 200,000. And once again, I have to say that we see people manipulating the data from what has been collected to suit different points of analysis, often predetermined. For example, yesterday, the United Kingdom, Britain, announced that they have revised downward their death count by about 5,000. And in the fog of the pandemic, I believe that there's been a lot of data collection that isn't accurate. We've had our own glitches here in California. And fundamentally, as I've argued before, we can't really rely on this data for instant analysis as we're in the thick of a pandemic. the standards for what is a COVID death, what is a death with COVID, they vary all over the place, kind of like our election standards here in the U.S. And so it's very difficult to, in my view, reach any meaningful conclusions based on the numbers that we have so far. And here comes some more numbers, all right, related to COVID-19 cases among children. A recent study from the American Academy of Pediatrics found that almost 339,000 cases among children have been reported since the start of the pandemic, with 97,000 of those in just the last 2 weeks of July. And, of course, this data surfaces as there's a lot of pressure to reopen schools. That's a complicated issue because we don't have child care. Parents need to work. Parents don't have work. Homeschooling and remote learning are often less than ideal. So it's a sticky wicket, there's no doubt about it. But there are, I think, legitimate concerns about the risk of infecting children who go back to school, and those children may be asymptomatic, carry it home, give it to a teacher or a staff member. And my view at this point is we should not be risking those potentials given what we know right now. Well, the airlines are announcing that the gift they got from Washington in the CARES Act, that money is starting to run out. And so because they have to give notice under union contracts, major airlines have warned that they'll be laying off tens of thousands of workers in October. So we're going to have a second wave, not necessarily of the virus, but of economic slowdown and retrenchment. Employment in the air industry fell from 512,000 in March of 2020 to about 380,000 in June, even though they got that money to pay their workers, right? So American has warned it will lay off up to 20,000 employees. More than 41,000 have already opted for early retirement, a reduced work schedule, or a partially paid leave. United has said that it will lay off 36,000 employees, about half of its U.S. workforce. JetBlue, they say around 20,000 employees have already taken voluntary leave. Southwest, 17,000 have taken retirement or extended leave. Spirit, wow, I didn't know they had any employees. That is the El Cheapo airline, and they are announcing 20 to 30% cuts. Alaska, 7,000 employees. And the outlier here is Delta. They've managed to avoid plans to conduct furloughs and layoffs so far because 20% of their employees took a voluntary leave. This is the most cruel story that I have reported in recent weeks. The new government in Greece has secretly expelled more than 1,000 refugees from its borders in recent months. Some of them are placed on life rafts that may be leaky and are often overcrowded. They don't have motors or oars or sails. And at least 1,072 asylum seekers since March have been dropped at sea by Greek officials in 31 separate expulsions. They're just casting them adrift and leaving them to die or to be rescued maybe by a Turkish ship. I mean, this is just so cruel. It's brutal. It reflects what started in the United States, was picked up by Italy. Hungary is a hardliner in brutal treatment of people who seek comfort. So I have good news and bad news about Joe Biden and immigration policy. He announced it was on August 4th, an agenda for the Latino community. And he promised to essentially adopt a sanctuary policy nationwide. similar to the sanctuary city laws and a sanctuary state law that we have here in California. And it gets into the weeds of Section 287G of our immigration law. But Biden said that these types of agreements undermine trust and cooperation between local law enforcement and the communities they're charged to protect. As president, Biden will end all of the agreements, this is of collaboration between local agencies and ICE, that were entered into by the Trump administration and aggressively limit the use of this 287G clause and similar programs that force local law enforcement to take on the role of immigration enforcement. I like that. But over at The Intercept, under the byline of Aida Chavez, we learn that Joe Biden made a commitment for a 100-day moratorium on any deportations of immigrants already in the United States should he be elected president. But what we see is that this has not been listed in any way, shape, or form in the Democratic platform or even on the website of the Biden campaign regarding his positions on immigration issues. And finally today, Radio Free Europe, the Voice of America, Radio Marti, Al Hura, Radio Liberty, these are long-standing operations of the U.S. government. They are propaganda organs. But at least from what they tell us, and I haven't listened to any of those outlets in a long, long time, they were striving to present balanced information about U.S. perspectives to audiences all across the globe. So Trump appointed a crony, Michael Pack, who is a pal of Steve Bannon, to run the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That is the umbrella agency that operates all of these different propaganda machines. And now we're already seeing results. There's been a purge of top officials, just like at the post office, and the hiring of people who can be relied upon to deliver friendly reporting that Trump would love and even tweet about. So, for example, Voice of America, on the day that Biden named Harris as his running mate, put out a worshipful tweet about Mike Pence, who it said had weathered storms that have shaken the Trump White House, standing by the president through an impeachment trial and many cabinet shuffles. There's also a happy talk report about Ivanka Trump, continuing women empowerment agenda amid the pandemic. The story makes clear that she was one of several officials and business leaders announcing new funding of women's economic projects. So what used to be a kind of middle-of-the-road propaganda machine is now just operating in the right lane 24/7. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. Yeah, it's on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.